Welcome to 5 Dubs by MDDC Press. I'm your host, Rebecca Snyder, the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, and DC Press Association, which represents news media in our region. 5 Dubs focuses on the who, what, when, where, and why of local news media. We'll talk with the journalists about the stories behind the news. You can find more information about our guests in the show notes or on our website, www.5-dubs.com. Welcome. I am so excited to have a brand new newsroom in the Mid-Atlantic area. Today we have Abby Higgins and Eric Falquero from the 51st Newsroom. So welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah,
It's great
a
to be here,
delight.
Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you. And so your newsroom is very, very new. So Eric, why don't we start with you? Tell us what the 51st Newsroom is, and then we can get into why it's here and what you're trying to do.
Sure thing. We are a worker-led nonprofit newsroom serving DC, and we just launched a public crowdfunding campaign about 3 weeks ago. And so we're all former DCist and WMU employees, and we're working to build a better local news site to add to the ecosystem here in DC.
That's amazing. So before we get much farther, let's give that URL for the crowdfunding. So if people are listening along, how can they either contribute or find your site?
We're using a platform called GiveButter. So it's givebutter.com/the51st.
Okay, and that's 51ST, right?
Mm-hmm.
The 51st. Okay. Thank you very much. And actually, I wanted to ask about worker-led. So I think the world is getting more familiar with nonprofit newsrooms. They're proliferating. But worker-led newsrooms is a new twist. So tell us a little bit about what that means in practice.
I can take that one. So worker-led newsrooms are a relatively new trend that we're starting to see in journalism. And it was one that all of us co-founders were really inspired by. There are newsrooms like Hellgate, which is a local newsroom in New York. There is a publication called Defector, which covers sports and politics and other pop culture issues. There's 404 Media, which covers technology. And what a worker-led newsroom is that at its most basic form, the journalists who are producing the news are also making the decisions about the future of the newsroom and coverage areas and how the organization is going to operate. So being worker-led usually means that the organization is more democratic and collective. We have 6 co-founders, and the 6 of us are building this operation collectively. And I think anyone who has spent any time in journalism, or even any time as a consumer of journalism, is really familiar with what happens a lot, unfortunately, these days, which is extremely hierarchical newsrooms and news operations, where executives at the top are making all of the decisions about the future of the newsroom and about the work lives of the journalists who work there. And those people at the top are not always the people who know the most about journalism or who necessarily care the most about the consumers of that journalism. So that's a paradigm that we're really looking forward to changing, is building a newsroom where the workers are empowered to make decisions, and the workers are also in direct conversation with community members and readers about what they want to see covered and what they want from local news.
That's terrific. So it's sort of like hyper collective and hyper local all in one spot. And so you've truly just launched. It's been a matter of weeks/months that this has been bubbling around. Tell me a little bit about what prompted this newsroom. I think there's always a call, an ache, a need for more local coverage. So I'm always in favor of more. But tell us how the 51st kind of came about. Abby, do you want to take that, or Eric?
Yeah, Eric, go for it.
Yeah, so back in February, the newsroom I mentioned that we all worked for, WAMU, cut 16 of its staff members.
Mhm.
And that was all mostly folks dedicated to local news and in some way working on the DCist.com website. And so that left a huge hole in what was already a shrinking local news ecosystem. Washington Post's local section had already experienced cuts. The Washington City paper had already downsized and cut its print run. The list goes on and on. And there were, say, I believe it was 4 journalists left at the local news desk at WMU. So we not only all found ourselves facing the same sort of situation of what's next, what do we do now, we all, as passionate local journalists wanting to serve our community, saw the gap just ever increasing of what was not going to be covered in our community. And I should say, not all of us were part of those layoffs explicitly.
Mhm.
I was, as well as one other co-founder, but all of us were involved with WMU at that time or up until very recently. And so as we were sort of collecting ourselves and supporting each other in figuring out what was next, one of our co-founders, Maddie Poor, had gone around and almost half jokingly said, like, worker-owned local news when? And it became pretty serious pretty quickly when enough of us responded positively.
That's exciting. So being on sort of like this forefront of local news, and you have the crowdfunding campaign, and certainly with the idea that you're being worker led and community sourced in some way, what's been what has the community said? What are you feeling in the moment about how you're being received in the world?
Well, I think the first thing is just that the community outpouring of support for the 51st has been overwhelming. People are so excited about it. We raised over $100,000 in our first day, and the majority of those donations are from small donations, are from
Mhm.
individuals who are, giving their hard-earned money to support a local news operation. So one thing that has immediately become very clear to us, it's something that we had a hunch about as journalists and as people who have been
Mhm.
operating in the local news ecosystem for a long time, but we have a real proof of concept of it now, which is that people are desperate for more local news and people are desperate for information about what's happening in their neighborhood and what's happening in their community. What events are going on over the weekend. Um, and as I mentioned before, it's been really, really important for us to fold community engagement in right from the beginning of our operations.
Mhm.
And so we've been having pop-ups around DC. We've gone to the Ward 8 Farmers Market, the DuPont Farmers Market, the Bloomingdale Farmers Market, Eastern Market, and we're continuing to have new locations throughout the month. And we're asking people, what do you want to see from local news coverage?
Mhm.
And what we have heard has been really heartening and really exciting. People are showing up to our stand with really thoughtful, innovative, interesting ideas. People want to see closer coverage of local politics. They want to see
Sure.
closer coverage of what city council is up to. They want to see more transportation coverage, whether that's like what's happening with WMATA or whether that's improved bike infrastructure. One thing I have thought is really interesting is that people have been really thoughtful about coverage of crime or violence. They've really said that they want more coverage of that, but they want more contextualized coverage of that. They
Mhm.
want coverage of,
What
we
does
have a
that mean? I'm sorry to break in there. What does that mean
totally
when you say
fine.
contextualized coverage? Because I think that's you're sort of the breaking news would be the transactional sort of piece. But tell me what you mean by contextual coverage.
Yeah. So, one of the things that we've seen is that when you strip local news down to the bone, all is left is the coverage of what and not the coverage of why or how.
Hmm.
So, you have coverage that a shooting happened, or, you have coverage that there was a murder, or you have coverage that carjackings are up, but you don't have coverage about the people who are most impacted by that crime. Who are the people who are mourning their children? Who are the people who don't feel safe walking in their neighborhood? Who are the people who don't have secure housing? So they don't have anywhere to spend their days or their nights safely. Inflation is out of control in this country, and DC is an incredibly expensive place to live. So
Right.
people are having more and more trouble affording their basic needs. And sometimes that is something that exacerbates crime and exacerbates people's desperation. So you really need like contextualized crime coverage.
Right. So, and I'm curious, DC is a huge space, a lot of wards, a lot of people in and out, a lot of big issues. And you're 6 co-founders and, you are building this newsroom. So how do you plan to kind of scale up? You kind of have to start from where you are, obviously, and you want to cover everything. And, just the laundry list of, you could have 6 reporters on each of those beats that you mentioned: transportation, crime, city council, local politics, and whatnot. So, what's your strategy and kind of how you build it out?
Yeah, great question. It's something that we are entering looking to enhance local news coverage, not be the end all be all place that you're going to get
Mhm.
every piece of information that you need. And we're also looking to grow sustainably. So we're being thoughtful about how much support we can get and sort of making our plans based on that. Um, and so we're starting with our 6 co-founders and freelancing for the most part.
Mhm.
Um, Based on the success of this campaign, that may be another staff member or something, but
Mhm.
we're assessing that as we go. And we're also looking to have a program unlike anything that local news currently has, and that will have community outreach. So the terms that we've used are toggling between community connector or information organizer, but essentially someone who's
Mhm.
not part of the week to week reporting process, but is instead building relationships with community members. So listening consistently with folks in their immediate network about what's most important, what information folks need, and bringing that back to our newsroom. So we'll be working with freelance reporting, but also
Mhm.
with freelance information gathering and sort of maintaining relationships in that way. So we're
I
looking
think
to build unique reporting that.
well, and I do feel like that's really unique because, it's sort of a different spin on the citizen journalist. People will tell you certain things, of course, but the idea recently, there's been a lot of talk about, the gaps in coverage. There's always been talk of gaps in coverage, but how news media can really proactively reach out to a community to find the gap. Traditionally, publications will do their readership survey, but that's kind of in an echo chamber. They're talking to the people who already read them. And so as you kind of build this really innovative piece of the community connector or the community listener, how do you plan to reach out to that gap? Is it someone who's really engaged in the community that you're looking for community leaders to be the pipeline, do you think? Or is it coming sort of people with a journalistic kind of view going out and non-judgmentally listening? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. And I mean, we're still figuring this out is sort of the first thing that I'll say. But I think we're not thinking that these people would be journalists or journalists in the traditional sense. We're thinking that these people are highly connected community members. They're the person who always knows what's going on in the neighborhood, and they're the person who knows everybody and connects people to each other and is always sort of at the center of community happenings. Someone who is also just like who's social and who's good with people and who's a good listener.
Hmm.
And I think another thing that I'll add to that is that we're definitely thinking about how to hear story ideas from people and listen to people about to understand more about the community issues that they care about, but we also want to make sure that our journalism is getting back to them. That's something journalism can sometimes be a one-way street, and it can sometimes be a bit extractive. And we really want to make journalism more circular. So how can these information organizers not only listen to their community members and hear what they want to cover, but also bring our stories back to them, and ask community members. Everyone consumes news differently. And technology and the algorithms that we are all stuck with mean that our information networks are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So we really want to be creative about breaking outside of those information networks and thinking about how we can use direct in-person conversations. And also things like, should we be printing our articles out? Should we occasionally have print editions? We want to experiment with WhatsApp distribution channels, particularly for immigrant communities in DC. So just like really being really thoughtful about how we can listen to people, but also make sure that people are hearing and benefiting from and participating in the journalism that we produced.
But I think also when you talk about sort of the different channels that you could go down, like maybe it'll be print sometimes, maybe it's a WhatsApp, maybe it's, maybe it's a traditional website. It feels like because you are kind of platform agnostic, which I think is an important part of where journalism needs to grow and change, that you're focusing on kind of the act of journalism and the storytelling, as opposed to, well, we've got to feed a website that comes 24 hours with an e-edition that does, something different. So I feel like, when you're starting things up, it can be exhilarating because you have all those possibilities out there. It's like uncut fabric on the table. So as you've kind of blue skied this, how have you kind of informed the choices that you want to make? You had talked about some other worker-led newsrooms. There's certainly interesting nonprofit models out there. How have you cast your net to come up with some of the ideas, and where are you seeing the gaps?
I'll just jump in quickly with one clarification, and then Eric, if you have thoughts on that question. I will say that we are starting out as a weekly newsletter, and we are going to have an online website, and those will be like our primary distribution methods and primarily how folks can find us. But agreed that we will definitely be experimenting with different platforms and distribution methods as well.
Sure. Well, you have to live somewhere, but that doesn't mean you can't vacation in other places.
I like that.
Yeah, and that's a part of the benefit of us being the size that we are too, is we're very nimble, right? Like both being worker led and being able to make decisions and pivot pretty quickly, but also being a small team. Like we're able to iterate very, very quickly. So as Abby said, we're starting as the newsletter and we'll have the footprint on the website, but being able to do a print edition for a specific topic or being able to do a WhatsApp distribution channel for a specific group, those are things we're able to experiment with and figure out what works and stick with that for a short term if that's what's appropriate, right? Or make it a long-term commitment if we find that that's what's needed. So that's been a big part of it. But to answer your question, the way that we've really dreamed this up and researched this is by talking to so many other people and building on the shoulders of so many other people that are working in this space. We mentioned a print edition. A great example of a group we talked to is a nonprofit outlet, LA Public Press. And they produced a explainer about how to hold your landlord accountable, to get them to make repairs and that kind of thing. But because of talking to elders who needed this information and various sources and whatnot along the way, they decided to make that not only a piece on their website, which it is, but also a printed zine. And that's fully illustrated. It's very fun. I believe it's called How to Sue Your Landlord. So like it's got some attitude to it. But it's also this very well laid out explainer of how to engage with these laws and civic processes.
And I feel like that could just, I'm sorry to jump in, but I had this idea that like you can team very often. There's a lot of advocacy community workers or helpers that would probably find a well-reported, zine on housing advocacy really pertinent to what they do. And so like the idea of partnering in that community and being really enmeshed it seems like a very exciting idea to me, at least. So you've worked with the LA Press. Are there other places that you feel like you've kind of been inspired by?
Yeah, I mean, there are tons of folks in the journalism space. LA Public Press, many that Abby noted earlier, 404 Media, Hellgate in New York, The Appeal. Who else? Block Club Chicago is a big one. They're also a nonprofit. Also, the DCist of Chicago is who led to their founding. And their model is having hyperlocal reporters, like a reporter for each neighborhood that they end up covering.
Mm-hmm.
So just a lot of the experimentation and work, both in worker-led media and nonprofit media specifically, has been what's led to what we're doing now.
Great.
And the generosity of those people giving their time. I apologize.
Well, because that is a lot, to share what that model is. And I feel like all of those are fairly new organizations as well. So they're building, they're figuring it out themselves too. But Abby, it looked like you were going to say something. Share.
Yeah, I was just going to throw in another. We're also part of the Tiny News Collective, which is an incubator for small news organizations. And a lot of these like early startup local news organizations are a part of that collective. We're also a member of Beloved Community Incubator, which is a cooperative incubator here in DC. So there are some really cool networks popping up to help birth some of these new ideas. And I think something that I've been thinking about so much is that journalism and media is a really depressing space to be right now. And all of us have been through layoffs ourselves or, watched our friends get laid off, have dealt with so much personal precarity as a result of the field, but also just like a lot of, a lot of like panic and fear about what it means that our basic sources of information are systematically being eliminated. And all of that is true, but crisis also breeds innovation, right? And I think what I am really inspired by is our efforts and all of the efforts of these folks who we've mentioned to really ask, how do we get local news back? But how do we leave what was never working about local news and about news more generally, right? It is never like news has never equitably served communities. News has never, not never, but has not nearly often enough had communities at its center. And news has not always been a great place for workers. So I think it's really exciting and inspiring to be in a lot of conversations where we're like, how can we rebuild this? But how can we rebuild something that's much better than we ever had?
Well, and I do feel like rebuilding is kind of a misnomer. It really is a reimagining. It's sort of stripping it down to say this is because news access to information is critical, especially the more local you get, like that no one else is doing that kind of news. Everyone gets so, especially in DC, so excited about the federal stuff or national politics. But in the big scheme of things, it's what's happening in your local ward or your local neighborhood that's really affecting your life. Like it's your schools, your city council member, whatever the case might be. And so I think the more we can help people understand that, local news is there to help them make decisions about how they want to live their lives. It's a really critical piece. And the good old days were not always good. So, why harken back to this idea of like, oh, well, the newsrooms of the 70s, that was when it was great. No, it was not great for a lot of people. So when you're kind of doing that imagining, are you kind of like, do you have to fight against your bias sometimes to be like, all right, if I'm really stripping it down to what's most important, like, do you find yourself sort of like, oh, well, gosh, we always used to do it this way. It would be easier to do it this way or more expedient. Do you find yourself kind of working through and winnowing your lived experience to create something that's not really been done often? Not to get too philosophical, but You're creating something brand new.
Man, do you have an answer to that, Eric? That's a good question.
it's, it's a great question. I think it's a little bit of both in that, yes, we're constantly sort of questioning our assumptions, and that's also, being a collective. What's been really great is being able to hear each
Yeah.
other's perspectives, and we talk to a lot of solopreneurs through the Tiny News Collective that are doing this kind of on their own,
Yeah.
and that asset of having 6 folks and so many other friends that volunteered to consult with us, friends and experts, to be able to learn from it. We've been able to kind of push back against some assumptions of how things have to be done just by
Hmm.
questioning each other and conversing, right? So I think that's been a huge asset. But we also all came into this work pretty opinionated about what didn't work and pretty
Yeah.
motivated to make something better. So I think we were already asking the right questions and in the right headspace to question each other.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, I do think that I mean, that's an interesting point. There was a lot of really amazing synergy between our team. I think it was actually like it's a little surprising in retrospect that we like got into initially a Zoom room together and very quickly we were like, these are the things that we want to leave behind in journalism, and these are the things that we don't need to do, and that we were really only doing because of these strict structures that existed in journalism, for unclear reasons.
Hmm.
And these are the things like deep community engagement and like collective decision making, that we really really want to implement. So I think if anything, it's been really freeing. And it's almost easier, right? It's easier to not have to constantly filter all of your ideas through the mechanisms, through the pretty narrow mechanisms that are allowed to you by like the company or organization that you're working for.
Hmm.
So I think if anything, it has felt pretty expansive to give ourselves the space to really think big about what journalism can be and not what it has to be.
Hmm. No, I think that's fascinating, and I love the idea of as a essentially kind of a collective. If you have your mission sort of honed well enough, everyone can sort of see how they fit into that mission and do their own thing. It's not that you're not communicating or saying, "Hey, I think we need coverage over here," or this, that, and the other. But it is a collective in some ways that it feels like you're describing, which sounds super exciting. And I wonder also, once this sort of gets up and running and more, I don't know, data or more lived experience comes through, there may be opportunities to filter that to current newsrooms. Certainly, I think the idea of deep community engagement, there's a lot of kind of hand wringing about like we've got to serve underserved communities, or we've got to do this, that, and the other. But unless you're really going out into that community and asking, well, what do you want to know about, and how can we reach you better? Like, where are you in the information sphere? I think that's always going to be a disconnect. So, um, when you're sort of, have you targeted specific communities? Do you think you're going to go neighborhood by neighborhood or topic by topic, or is it still up in the air at this point?
Well, so I think one thing I'll say is that a thing that I think we have been really enthusiastic about leaving behind, which I think is great, is a fierce sense of competitiveness amongst journalists and amongst publications, right? Like
Hmm.
we really want to see other publications as our partners. And we want to particularly see hyper local publications and community publications as our partners. As you said, we're a small team. And even if we expand, we will always probably be a relatively small team. And so we always want to make sure that we are working with the people who have been covering these issues for a long time, and who know these communities really well. So I think, we definitely want to be like co-publishing stories with other publications, and hosting events with other publications. in terms of like whether we're going community by community or topic by topic, we would love to eventually get to a place where we have an information organizer in each ward. So we really have someone who is a touchstone at each place in the city, who can really, be that community connection. So, and I think topic wise, we are sort of thinking about our topic in 4 initial buckets. One is covering the affordability crisis in DC, why things as basic as rent and groceries are increasingly out of reach. Another is thinking about investigations and accountability journalism. We all know that when local news reduces, malfeasance, corporate malfeasance, and political malfeasance increase.
100%.
Yeah. So we really, want to be a part of holding powerful people accountable. We also want to do a lot of service journalism. Eric talked about that in terms of, how to get your landlord to do things, how to apply for housing vouchers, how to, there are so many basic services that are really, really difficult to access. So how can we make that easier for residents? And then the last one is thinking about pride of place. We're all doing this in large part because we really, really love DC, and we're really proud to call this city home. And it has unique quirks and a culture that we all love being a part of and participating in and celebrating. So we really want to make sure that we're doing that with our coverage too. And that kind of at DCS we used to call them curiosities. And I think those are the things that really help you learn about and experience the texture of a city, and the fabric of a city, and what connects people to each other in a city.
Yeah, and it also makes that city more accessible, to others, because there's so many new people coming into DC all the time.
I say this all the time, but DCist is how I learned to become a DC resident. I moved here 6 years ago, and I didn't know many people in the city, and I didn't know a lot about it. And DCist was a big part of me falling in love with this city, because it taught me about the people who live here and their lives.
Well, and I hope the 51st Newsroom will do the same thing for many years for new residents and for people across the region. So I wish you the best. And so your crowdfunding campaign is going to continue on indefinitely, or is there a hard stop to that? Indefinitely, it looks like.
No, so that campaign ends on Tuesday the 13th, so coming up very soon, August 13th. But we will be launching a membership drive shortly following that, because we are ultimately looking for sustaining members. And you can always donate and support us. Just because the initial campaign is over doesn't mean you can't continue to help us out.
Absolutely. Well, I look forward to having you back again once you're sort of got your feet wet and know what you're a little bit farther on in your journey. But it's exciting to see this newsroom take shape, and with the idea of the worker-led newsroom, that's such a great innovative idea, and I wish you the best.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. We really appreciate you taking the time to chat. It was great to be here.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for listening to 5 Dubs with Rebecca Snyder. Please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts so that others can find us. What do you want to know about local journalism? Email me at rsnyder, SNYDER, @mddcpress.com. Interested in supporting our podcast and journalism? Please donate to our 501c3 Press Foundation. Find out more and see the full episode list and show notes at www.5-dubs.com.